joining us for another In Conversation. I'm Tasnim, and I'm joining you today from stunning and also kind of wet, unceded Ngunnawal land here in the nation's capital. I want to acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and that it's an immense privilege for us to be able to share stories on this land. I'm excited to be joined today by Brian Quirt. I met Brian in 2017 on the side of Sleeping Buffalo Mountain, the home of the Banff Centre for Arts and Creativity. That's where the Banff Playwrights Lab is held each year, a program that he's led since 2012. As a very young playwright who had mixed experiences working with dramaturgs up until then, what impressed me was Brian's immense ability to listen, to gently get to the heart of an issue, and to approach it all with an excellently wry sense of humour. What I'd come to learn is that the director of the Banff Playwrights Lab is just one of the many hats that Brian wears. He's the founder and artistic director of Nightswimming, a company that supports new Canadian performance works with commissioning and dramaturgical development. He recently wrapped up his term as board chair of LMDA, the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas, an organisation he's been involved with for the last 25 years, having also been the president of LMDA and the founder and former president of LMDA Canada. Along with his work as a dramaturg and advocate, he's worked as a director and as a playwright, having directed several Nightswimming commissions, including Carmen Aguirre's Broken Tailbone and Blue Box, and Anita Majumdar's Fish Eyes trilogy and Same, But Different. And you can see that I'm particularly interested in the work by women of colour. He's worked extensively as a dramaturg for theatre and for dance across major and independent companies, and he leads Nightswimming's research program that supports artists to pursue provocative theatrical questions. I'm going to leave it there because I start asking lots of questions. But first, Brian, welcome to NIDA In Conversation. It's really, really lovely to be speaking with you today.
Well, likewise, it's great to be here, well, not here, but also with you here, as you know what I mean. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation and have this wonderful opportunity to reconnect with you. And I just wanted to mention that I'm speaking to you from Takaranto, now known as Toronto, where Nightswimming is based and where I live in Canada. And I want to honor the ancestral caretakers and storytellers of this place that we call home and where we're privileged to live and work, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Wendat nations, and acknowledge that Toronto continues to be home to Indigenous and Métis and Inuit peoples from across Turtle Island. And I should also add that I'm here in Toronto. I'm a mere couple blocks from the pre-colonial shoreline of Lake Ontario, which through the massive colonial enterprise has been slowly extended far from where it was several hundred years ago because of railroads and ports and highways. But Nightswimming's office is just a couple blocks from here, exactly on that original pre-colonial shoreline. And that continually asks me to think about the land that we're on, the water that used to be right there. And that always leads me to the sky above and to that grouping of land, sea, and sky, and to think about the peoples whose stories used to live on this place. And I've been thinking a lot over the last year about the constellations above us and the stories of the constellations that peoples in different places of this world have told each other over so many centuries and millennia, and have slowly started to learn some of the stories of the constellations above this place. And they are fantastic, and I urge everyone to consider the stories that live above us as well as the ones that we tell each other.
Thank you. It's one of those really, I think it's such a gift to be able to be on this land. I mean, it's such a fraught history, and I have some questions for you later. But yeah, I'm in Canberra, the nation's capital, which means meeting place. And so often I think about that and what it means for us. It's a bit like Ottawa in that it's single purpose. And that's where the government comes to meet, but also it's where we all have the capacity to meet and share. And being a Sydney-based artist who's currently stranded in Canberra, during during this. It is an interesting thing to think about what that means to be here on this land, and also a land where I grew up,
right,
but hasn't been home for a very long time. I think, you know, during COVID, we've all sitting at home and sitting in these very kind of prescribed areas has made us all think about what it means, I think, to be home and what it means to be home on settled land as well. I want to start by asking you about your pathway into dramaturgy, because I think that's, I mean, you wear so many hats, but that's perhaps the thing that has been a through line throughout your career. What was your pathway into it? Was it something that you knew about early on and something that you were drawn to, or is it something that you kind of came to later?
I guess in between is the answer to that, like so many dramaturgical things. It wasn't really until the end of my university tenure, I got a master's in drama here at the University of Toronto. And I'm looking back, I realized that as I left that university program and started applying for jobs, and I have some of those embarrassing letters that you send out when you first seek a job, somewhere in a box, and they were inquiring about dramaturgical positions at various theaters, all the major theaters in Toronto, and all of them responded to some degree, and I had interviews with some. None of them had any dramaturgical positions, so it was very generous of them to even see me. There was literally no dramaturgical positions at that time. And looking back, I wonder how I knew to even ask for information or to apply for dramaturgical positions, given that there weren't any. And I think it was, looking back, due to one of the professors I had in that year of the master's, where Ronald Bryden, who had been literary manager at the RSC in the late 60s into the early 70s for a while. And I realized it was in one of his courses, it was the stories that he told about working with playwrights that somehow, you know, I didn't have a kind of an epiphany moment by any means, but as I think back to the stories that he told, and some of them were name-droppy stories, and some of them were nuts and bolts about process stories, about, you know, plays that are now famous and so on. But I think what I really was struck by was the relationship that he had with living playwrights in that particular moment, which was a really fertile one. And that's what stuck with me. And so as I tried to imagine what I would possibly do coming out of a master's in drama, I realized that it was that mixture of working with playwrights, exploring stories that hadn't yet been told, figuring out the puzzle of what a new creation is, let alone a new piece of theater. It was the collaboration that he had articulated between himself and playwrights, but also the larger team that ultimately comes together. It was the mystery and the figuring out of that puzzle that so attracted me, and that I think identified for me a place in the theater where I might fit, because I didn't imagine myself as a director at the time. I didn't imagine myself, I was certainly not an actor. I didn't think of myself as a creator or a theater maker, and didn't intend to make anything, even though I've gone on to do both that and direct. So I was looking for a niche in the theater world. And what those conversations in that last year of my education revealed is that there was one. There weren't many opportunities for that here in Canada, at least in Toronto at that time, or even across the country, but maybe they could be made. And what I learned, of course, is when you get into the field, is that work happens anyway. It was happening. Other people were doing it. They weren't called literary managers very often in Canada at the time, or even dramaturgs, but the work was happening. And I found relatively quickly my way into an environment where I could be at the center of that relationship between the storytellers that we call playwrights, directors and other collaborators, and theater organizations and audiences. And that told me that I had landed in the right spot.
Yeah, that's incredible. It's one of those things where even in Australia, there are so few opportunities to train specifically as a dramaturg. Right. And people kind of always find their way in sideways almost.
Which is, I think, the best way to come to dramaturgy. And this is not to criticize programs that teach dramaturgy and that train individuals in the field, but it's all the other things that we bring to this practice that I think makes dramaturgs so invaluable to the other individuals we collaborate with, and that draws out of us the things that we know, and also all of those things that we don't know that we know. And those are the beautiful things that I think dramaturgs add to processes here and elsewhere.
Absolutely. I mean, well, what does that process look like for you when you work with other artists as a dramaturg? I imagine it's, you know, specific to particular projects, but this is how I'm circumventing that dreaded question: what is dramaturgy? Because I think it's something that kind of comes out in the action, the practice of it. But how do you approach working with other artists?
Thank you for not asking me to define dramaturgy, because I avoid doing so as much as humanly possible. It is the worst. And at LMDA, I spent many years trying to push us way beyond trying to define it to even for each other, because it didn't seem like very useful work, because the work of dramaturgs happens in so many different ways, in so many different fields, obviously not only in the theater, but in many and most of the performing arts. Someone does this sort of work, which is about investigating the origins and helping to design the pathways of an individual piece in collaboration with the creator or creators. And by that, I mean, to me, it's about listening to those creators to uncover, to discover, to illuminate, to become familiar with the core ideas that they were initially inspired by, or struck by, or mesmerized by, or felt committed to investigate. And a huge part of my job is, okay, at the beginning of a new piece, and this often goes on for years, as you know, is to spend enough time with them in whatever way seems most fruitful to partly get to know them, which is often the part of the equation that is forgotten, but to get to know also the nature of the idea or ideas that they are intrigued by, that they feel compelled to explore for this piece, whatever this piece turns out to be. And through that investigation with them of what those ideas are, get to know them, and also help myself begin to generate opinions of my own about the nature of that piece and the ideas that are at the heart of it. And that's where the collaboration starts. And that's the collaboration that I'm so intrigued by. It's the relationship between myself and that creator or creators. And it's the interaction between what they know, or what they want to know, or they need to know about the question that they have at the heart of the piece. And my own developing understanding, or perhaps lack of understanding, sometimes that's even better, about those same issues. And the coming together of individuals around it, and the both the friction and the thrill of two or more people investigating those ideas is part of what pushes it forward, and also is the reward as a dramaturg for me of why it's so beautiful and vital and exciting to start work on new projects with artists. So that was a long answer to the very beginning of the process, but I'd linger on it because it's so central to wherever the process will go over the 3 to 5 to 10. I've worked on one project for almost 25 years now. Like these are long-term relationships, and the time we spend at the beginning is really critical to both what they are and what they become.
No, I think it's really important, because sometimes when I talk to people about working as a dramaturg or dramaturgy, it's about the work, and the way that, you've just spoken about it, is it's about the relationship with the artist and through that, the work, which I think is really important, because, with anything, the, I guess, mix of collaborators is really important, and the trust that's built. I want to ask about in the context of this, there are some relationships and some artistic partnerships that you kind of seems you've come back to, like, for example, like Anita Majumdar is someone who you've worked with a few times. How do those relationships that, you might have started 10, 15 years ago, how have those kind of shifted and grown? And then I guess both of your practice as a dramaturg, and then, the playwright or performer's practice, are those things that kind of happen together, or are there new things still left to discover when you've been working with someone so long?
Yes, there are absolutely new things to discover. The the getting older part for anyone, regardless of age, is a mixed, pleasure for sure. But the good part about it is that our breadth of experience changes, and we have new fascinations and new obsessions and new compulsions and new interests and new perspectives on old interests that drove us 10 or 15 years ago. So long-term relationships, part of what I think every working practice needs a mixture of both new partnerships and collaborations and long-term ones, partly so that we are always meeting and working with new artists and different generations of artists. I believe in a multi-generational creative practice. And we're engaged with ideas that we may not be familiar with or that are not as alive to us, given perhaps our age or our generation. But the long-term ones both offer us a shorthand in terms of the relationship with the artist we're working on. So one can often start, and I'm not a fan of working fast, but one can start faster and go further because you start a little further ahead. So the goal isn't to work faster, but if you start further ahead, maybe you can go farther over the long run. And a long-standing relationship means you just start at a different place on a new project. The conversations are able to start at a new place. You're not building relationship as part of the practice of starting this show. You might be expanding and finding new nuances, one hopes, in that relationship for sure, as new curiosities come to the fore and you discover new things about each other, which is also part of what the reward of it, right? So with Anita or with Carmen Aguirre or with Anosh Irani, who I'm also working with at the moment, all three of whom I've worked with for 10 or 15 or more years. And now I'm on second or third or fourth projects with them. Part of the fascination for me is what are they going to do next? And what of the many things that they're working on, because all of them are now senior or experienced artists. They have many projects, not all of them with me by any means. So what are the ones that are the best match for what I can bring to the conversation, that Nightswimming can bring to the conversation? And it's certainly not every project by either of those artists by any means. And part of the excitement is about having conversations with them over time, over many years sometimes, and going, what's the new thing that you're thinking about that is the right match for the type of collaboration that we have? That I have with Anita, that I have with Anosh, or that I have with Carmen, which is a little bit different for each of them and is a bit different with each project. And Anosh and I haven't worked on a show for more than 10 years, interestingly. And we've just circled around and found something that I think will be a collaboration that we'll work on over the next little while. And it was worth taking the time. We remained friends, we remained colleagues, we kept in touch. We always thought it would be great to work together again. But the piece didn't present itself, even though he's had many plays produced since he and I worked on Bombay Black together many years ago. So it's fascinating to watch oneself through these long-term creative relationships and friendships share a search with these people that we've become so close to for the thing that is the good match and the best match between us. Because if it's just any piece, then it's not that interesting to me. It has to be the one that is really best suited to what either of us can bring to it, and the mixture of what either of us or neither of us know about the topic. And the more questions we have about what we don't know, the more interesting that project is to me.
Yeah, absolutely. That exploration is always such a joy. You never know what you're going to find.
Exactly.
You mentioned Nightswimming there. Would you tell us a little bit about what it is and why you founded it? What kind of, I guess, you saw that it could, the gap that you saw that it could fill?
Sure. So there's sort of a two-part answer to that. The company was established just over 25 years ago for virtually the same reason that everyone starts a company. It's that there was a show I wanted to do. And I approached a friend of mine who was a stage manager and producer, Naomi Campbell, and said, I really love this show. I don't think that, given where I was at my career at that time, that I would be able to see it through to the end of its process, that it would end up with another theater. And because I wasn't that experienced, and reasonably so, other people might end up dramaturging or directing it, and I wouldn't be there. But I love this piece called Through the Eyes by Don Drick. And I wanted to be part of the process. And the way to be part of the process right to the end, to me, felt like directing it and figuring out how to do that. And that meant producing a workshop and producing the show independently. So I went to Naomi and said, would you join me on this adventure and try to find the money to develop and produce this show? And she said yes, and we did that, and we premiered it. And we came out of that going, that was a great success. The show was born. It's been well received. It's a beautiful play, which has since been revived and remounted. So we did our job as theater artists. We helped birth that show with that playwright. And then we had the decision that I think everyone does when you have a small company, a new company, is what do you do next? And maybe the decision is to not do anything and just fold the company, which is hard to do. And what we did know is we didn't want to just become another small independent theater company. Toronto had dozens and dozens and dozens of them at the time. I didn't think it needed yet another one. It was poorly funded. But I said, let's rather than just discard it and close the bank account and move on. Two things. One, she and I wanted to work together, continue to work together as producer and dramaturg and director. And I thought it was worth the time for us to think it through. And we just reconceived the company. We said if we didn't like the treadmill of producing, which we did not, and the fundraising that has to happen in order to generate enough money to produce a new show every 2 or 3 years, why don't we say it's a non-producing company? What if it didn't produce? Then what would it do? And ultimately, I applied what I think of now as a dramaturgical process to thinking about the company and treating the company as an artistic project. So I asked me and the company and Naomi, if it didn't produce, what would it do? And perhaps more interestingly, what could it do that I couldn't do anywhere else in my work at that moment? And what I decided, the thing that I wasn't able to do much at that time, was work on shows from conception, so before a draft exists. And then we said, so what would that mean? How would that happen? And I said, well, what if it was a company that only commissioned new works, that we weren't searching for plays to produce, we were looking for artists to commission to create new works of theater and music and dance. And I go, that starts to become a much more interesting creative combination, an opportunity. But then we said, we've just said that we won't be a producer. We won't produce the works that we work on, whatever they turn out to be. And that led us to conceive of it kind of fully as a dramaturgical company, that the focus would be entirely on commissioning and then designing a unique creative process for each show, independent of the other shows that we might have, and that it would be focused on the dramaturgy of the process, whatever that took, however long it took, until we could find a partner who would bring that show to the stage. So the process of creating the company was an inherently dramaturgical one, and that has inspired and shaped the company ever since.
Yeah, amazing. It is one of, yes, there are a lot of poorly funded independent companies, like you said, but like what Nightswimming has grown to become is something that, I really struggle to think of an equivalent anywhere else in the world. We certainly don't have one here. There are places to help support the writing of new work, but it's a very different kind of model. And you talked a little bit about that process of what it's like, working on something with Nightswimming. It's a very long process. Exactly as you said, you really appreciate what can come out of those slow processes, which, even just spending 13 days in Banff, where 10 of those days I spent staring at a mountain and had your full support, and about 2 days writing, is, I think it's a very, different way of thinking about it, because even with funding cycles, it's very end goal driven, and Nightswimming is very different in that way. You were saying that one of the projects you've worked on for almost 25 years, is that right?
Yep.
So is that informed by the idea, by the artist, by just the nature of what that relationship is? How does that work? How do you know when something is kind of needs that time or needs that space?
Well, they the show ultimately and the creator, but the show particularly ultimately tells us what the time it needs, or it should anyway. And lots of shows have a 3 to 4 year gestation period, which is, and that often doesn't include those years that a playwright or a creator has spent thinking about a piece in advance. So in some ways, how we count the time is often starts earlier than when most people might start that clock. So we certainly work on shows that find their form and reach an audience within 3 to 4 years. But 4 to 7 is perhaps more common, partly because, and this is increasingly true with our work, that a lot of it is based on working in studio. It's about discovering in the room rather than purely playwright-driven texts. We do a bit of all of that because we like to work across different forms, not just playwright-driven text-based plays, although also those. And working in studio, it doesn't necessarily take longer, but it I think beneficially sometimes asks us to work not slowly, but I wrote an article a couple years ago called "Work Quickly but Think Slowly," and what I like about that is it suggests when we're in studio we work quickly because you're trying to generate, to think, to enact, to embody, to investigate, to study, to examine, to build. But by doing those processes iteratively over time, you're also asked to think slowly about the generation of the piece and how it will evolve over time. And I think there's huge merits to both of those approaches. The other issue is, of course, scale. Some shows, in terms of their scale, and smaller scale, to me, can be just as powerful, but sometimes that permits a faster creation process, at least time-wise. The show that has taken, that we've been engaged with for 25 years, called City of Wine by a playwright named Ned Dickens. And the challenge there has been scale, that it came out of a project, a version of Oedipus that a company here in Canada called Die in Debt Theatre commissioned close to 30 years ago now. And as Ned and I worked on that, he was the playwright and I was the dramaturg, we realized, as we talked about the world of Oedipus, that we're actually more interested in Jocasta and in Creon and those characters who bounce around and obviously Jocasta dies in Oedipus, but we're like, there's so much more life and life force to Jocasta, for example, and there's so much more depth to Creon, but there aren't the plays to investigate them in. So Ned, as we left that project, decided that he would write them, that they needed to exist. And so Nightswimming commissioned those two plays, Jocasta and Creon. And then as we worked on those with Ned, he conceived ultimately of a 7-play cycle about the city of Thebes called City of Wine. And so we commissioned the other 6 plays in addition to Oedipus. And so 7 full-length plays, that takes time. And in a most beautiful, remarkable, powerful way. And because we're not a producing theater at Nightswimming, we commit to not produce the shows that we commission. We were able to both accept and to welcome and intensify Ned's vision of this enormous 7-play cycle, because we weren't limited by cast size. We're not going to be producing them, so we wanted the shows to be what they wanted to be. I want a show to be the best expression of what the show wants to be. And these are, not all of them are large, but the 7 plays have a total cast of around 96 before significant doubling. So we felt none of the usual monetary obstacles to commissioning those plays. It was hugely expensive for us to develop in any case, but to work on that scale is vital. Our theater industry, I don't know if this is true in Australia, it is very challenging for artists to work on that scale, let alone think about working on that scale. They know in their hearts and in their bones that the chances of getting large-scale plays like that on stage is very slim in Canada. And it's improving a little bit, I believe. But 20 years ago, when we started working with Ned on those shows, we knew there was huge challenges to getting those plays on stage. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't exist, that our playwrights need to write about communities. If we're not writing about communities, and communities, to write about communities, you need bodies. You need to put some larger number of the members of a community, of the citizens of a place, the people on stage to examine a community, rather than a small component of a community. Both of those have value. These large-scale plays allowed us to, in this case, explore a community over multiple generations. That felt both worthy and important and valuable, and more so than it was to worry about whether they would ultimately be produced. And they have been challenging to produce. That has never changed, but that doesn't make their existence less important to, obviously, to Ned as a writer, but to the theatre world here in Canada. And I firmly believe, and we continue to support them and Ned in a variety of ways, is that they will ultimately happen. And those stories will be told in the way they should be told, and we'll work on them until they do.
There's something so glorious about a company that's committed to not producing work. You know, I have a lot of friends who are playwrights, and you know, that question that you have all the time with a commission is, you know, are they going to put it on? Are they going to put it on? Because that's why you're being paid the money to write the thing. But yeah, the thought of being able to create and dream and, you know, do that without boundaries is such a gift. And I mean, those obstacles absolutely exist in Australia as well. You know, I really struggle to think of anything with significant cast size outside of, you know, an international arts festival context. Or even, I mean, I've been watching lots of streamed ballet during the last year and a half because it's kind of theatre adjacent, but doesn't crush me in the way that, you know, having to watch actual theatre and not being there.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. And also ballet's very expensive. And so I'm like, yeah, I will watch streamed versions. But like the fact that there's 45 people on a stage is just, it happens. You will have that many bodies in the space. So I think it's really extraordinary to even think of works on that scale. Because I think a lot of creators will do that. We will, you know, mentally edit down however many people it is, and until we end up with a lot of two-handers. I wanted to actually ask you about your process working between text pieces and dance pieces or movement pieces, or even things that kind of exist between. Like, you know, I've read, I obviously wasn't able to see it, but read about Carmen Aguirre's broken tailbone, and it's like descriptions of it are, it involves a salsa lesson, which sounds amazing. And, you know, people are advised to wear comfortable shoes because they'll be on their feet. What is the process of working on something like that, where, you know, it doesn't have necessarily the structures that one would think of, or the kind of really theatrical kind of signposts that we might expect in a work of
what I love about, and I'll talk about broken tailbone in a little more detail, but what I love about working in works that have a huge physical component in whatever form it takes, or a huge musical, or we've worked on a series of 5 or 6 shows that incorporate really extensive vocal singing by performers, but also by audience members. And part of what to me unites those approaches to creating new works in those realms, movement and singing, is that they have to be worked on in the studio, or at least with bodies in a place. That you can go away and think about them, and you can, you know, sort of structure them or make notes, but we really focused on making those in the room. That talking about movement is not that interesting after a certain point. Talking about singing, maybe even less so to some degree. So all of these works that we've made over the last 10 or 15 years have been made in studio. And one artist I worked with some years ago, we made a commitment when we were working on a show about a singing ensemble that we would basically just wouldn't work on it in between the studio sessions. Because if we did, one, it wasn't as exciting and as captivating and as energizing to work separate from the voices and the bodies of the show, but also it might lead us to making it more like a play, and it might lead us back into, you know, we're both theater artists more than musicians or movement artists, so we were concerned that our upbringing and our familiarity with text-driven plays would influence the piece if we worked on them or if we scripted them outside of the room. And I've really stuck to that, not for all the pieces I work on, but particularly ones that are about the voice and about the body. That we avoid the word text. We talk about scoring these pieces. We use musical terminology. We do everything we can to separate us from the idea of a play, because just as your point is that there's nothing wrong with plays, but they do come with expectations, and they come with expectations both in terms of audiences ultimately, but how they got made by artists, about the structures that are used, about the narrative signposts that we are all so familiar with, all of which are really valuable in certain circumstances and are, I believe, obstacles in other circumstances. So for Broken Tailbone, for example, once I went to Carmen with this idea, said, Carmen, you love to salsa, and among many other dances, and I've seen you teach people very quickly, in a very basic way, how to salsa. I've watched her do it on stage, and I said, I wonder if there's a show in which you teach the audience to dance. And I was thrilled by this idea of would an audience go with that? Would they permit themselves to be taught to dance, even if they don't know how to salsa? And Carmen was totally game and went away and said, okay, I'll think about that. I'll think about the dances. I'll think about music, and I'll think about what else might be involved. And she came back to us with, said yes. She came back with a group of about 100 songs that she loves to dance to at Latinx dance clubs in Vancouver, where she's based. And so we put together a process where in the room, where we didn't ask Carmen to write this piece. We asked her to come to Toronto, or I would go to Vancouver, and we would get together in a room with her and a couple other artists, and we would listen to the songs. And we would, God help her, she tried to teach me to salsa, which was, while not a success, made a point of how good she is at teaching non-dancers how to dance, how comfortable she makes them. But there's theater in that. There's or maybe drama is a better word, because there's friction between what we can do, what we want to do, what we wish we could do, what we watch her do. And we also realized as we listened to these songs together, that she had a story for each song. That each 3 or 4 minute song was a little capsule connected to some part of her life, sometimes her present life, sometimes the world she goes in which to dance, sometimes a family story. Many of the stories connected to her work in the underground movement in Chile in the 80s and through the 90s. Each of these stories was so distilled and so connected to the music that what happened is we distilled this list of 100 songs down to the now 15 that are actually in the show, is that we picked the songs partly for the music, for the dance they were connected to, but also the story that Carmen associated with this piece of music. And so we started to structure a show around what turned out to be 15 songs that were linked episodically by moments in her life. That, to me, becomes a really interesting and powerful structure. It has inherent variety because each of the songs was from a different country. They covered 40 years. They told in some ways part of the history of Latinx dance music over the last 40 years. They told part of Carmen's story, her family's story, the Chilean exile story, or at least one aspect of it. All of these stories were imbued within and embodied by these amazing pieces of music. All of this was discovered in the room. We never wrote it down. It was only towards the very end, when the piece had sort of found its shape, that the stories, which were all improvised by Carmen on her feet, we asked her never to write them down in advance. Only at the end of it did we start to go, okay, this order has found its feet, as it were, and we'll start to make notes on what the stories are for each song. So it was really important to me that we found the piece through our bodies and through being together and through conversation, where we could work quickly as we went through these songs, but think very slowly between these sessions which often were months, many months apart, we would think slowly between them what we wanted to do in the next process when we gathered together. What were the ideas or issues or opportunities that we needed or wanted to explore? And then we started doing each process would include an audience. We had to go, will an audience dance? How will they dance? What will they dance? What is it like to invite, or in Carmen's case, sometimes command an audience to dance? What does it mean if she dances with them? What does that do? What's the degree of difficulty? Anyway, you can imagine there's thousands of questions that come up, but all of it was in the room. And that, anyway, is a long answer to what I find the beauty of working that way is it's so tangible. And that isn't better than working on a script by a playwright, but it's inherently different. And in my world as a dramaturg, one feeds the other. I have a real, I resist working the same way all the time as much as possible. So one of my criteria for the shows we create at Nightswimming is that they be as different as possible, and that the processes that they demand that we invent be different, or rather the processes they demand that we invent are specific and unique to that show. So we compel ourselves to design the show's process actually for that show in response to what that show wants to be. And that to me is exciting.
That is so exciting. I mean, even just you speaking about the genesis of the project, usually you think of an artist kind of approaching and commissioning with like, oh, I've got this kernel of an idea. But, based on your very long working relationship with Carmen, you knew this about her. You knew that there was potentially something there, which I think is such a great way of working. And it's I think just that process, exactly what you said of, thinking slowly but working fast. And having all that time in between to grow and develop, and not being allowed to write things, which is good for me to remember that sometimes you don't find things in the writing of them. Often it can ossify something needlessly.
True, or you find things when you write it down later. That Broken Tailbone, when we created a score for that ultimately, because eventually, we needed stage managers because we became a show, right? And we've toured it all around Canada. And so we have stage managers, and not surprisingly, they like having something they can follow as the show occurs, as do lighting designers. So at a certain point, to facilitate those parts of the process, you need something. So we have what we call a score, which is kind of like an outline of the show with a certain amount of detail. But then we made discoveries through that process too. We just made sure we made that score at a point when it contributed to the process, it didn't potentially become an obstacle. It didn't ask us to close the generative part of the process too soon. It became something that we needed to do in response to another part of the process, which was performance. And then that, as we scored it, we go, oh, there's links, there's ideas that we can now accentuate or amplify or shape even further. So it becomes a valuable part of the process, but it just at a very different point in the process. So that too has been a discovery that's valuable.
I want to ask you about the Banff Playwrights Lab as well. So when I attended, it was still called the Banff Playwrights Colony. And I think it was the last year, actually. And I mean, there were many reasons the name was changed, as was communicated to kind of better fit the program as a place to try things out, but also because of the weight of the word colony, particularly in countries that are still colonized. What are some of the ways in which the Playwrights Lab and you as the director, as someone who kind of gets to steer the conversation that happens, artists that come, has fostered and championed even diverse and particularly First Nations voices? Like, I mean, the year I was there was also the year that Tara Began and Andy Morrow were there developing Dear Woman,
right.
Which I think I missed the reading because we got lost on a 10K hike is what happened. But
that is a problem in Banff.
It happens. It happens. I think Jenna, who's one of the other dramaturgs, just managed to make it, but I did not. and it came to the Sydney Festival in 2019. I mean, the former Sydney Festival director, Wesley Enoch, is a First Nations man, and commissioned a lot of, brought over a lot of Canadian work, particularly First Nations work, and that was a particularly powerful one. And reading a bit about that project, it got its first shows in New Zealand and Australia rather than in Canada. I mean, what has been the process for the lab and for working with artists such as Tara and Andy, but also kind of more broadly in working with First Nations artists?
Thank you. It was about being really specific about some of the priorities of the lab and the curation of it and the adjudication of it when I started as program director 7 or 8, 9 years ago now. Some of it were, for example, that we have a small acting company, as you know, who are part of the lab each year. So it was crucial to me that a majority of those members of the acting company were actors of color. That there always be at least one, and at the beginning, and now it's at least 2, and it's often more than 2 of those actors are Indigenous artists. Whether they ultimately will be working on Indigenous plays or not. The fact that they always are is also a value of the lab, but they're there to work on all of the plays, not just Indigenous plays. It was important to me that a majority of the playwrights who come to the lab are women. And I'm not sure of the statistics in Australia, but I suspect that they're not dissimilar to Canada in terms of the number of plays that are produced annually, which has been slowly growing from an abysmal number of percentage of plays by women to a merely appalling number of plays by women. So it was hugely important to me that the majority of playwrights be women, that the number of artists of color be massively increased, both among the playwrights, among the acting company, among the collaborators that artists are invited to invite to the lab if they wish. Partly to do 2 things. One is to help change. We're not doing it alone by any means at the Banff Centre, but to help change the resources that are directed to artists telling different stories, to stories that are not commonly seen on our stages. And if we change the writers whose stories reach our stages, we change the stories and we change the impact. And it was absolutely crucial to me that, for instance, the playwright in residence at the Banff Playwrights Lab in my tenure is an artist of color. It's that simple. We've just inaugurated a new faculty position for an Indigenous creator in residence who might be a playwright, but might be a choreographer, or might be a designer, or they can be whatever field makes the most sense to the lab in the future, so that we will always have an Indigenous artist as part of the adjudication and the faculty of the lab. The lab isn't an Indigenous program, but it's critical for the lab to always have Indigenous artists in every part of the landscape and the environment of the lab, both acting and as playwrights, as faculty, as collaborators. Again, whether they're working on an Indigenous focused or based project or not. In the same way that I think, it's like the statistics are only are not the reason we do it, but they're the way we convince the organization that the choices we make are having impact. And what I've been most pleased by, maybe not most pleased by, but delighted by, is that I do keep track of the shows that come to the Playwrights Lab that go on to production. And often that takes many years. You well know that, right? That the shows that come to the lab some are at the very beginning of their pathway, some are closer to production. And over the last couple of years that I've looked at the statistics of the shows that have gone on to production, the majority of the shows that have gone on to production from the Playwrights Lab have been by women of color, and by playwrights of color. And not all of that is attributable to the Playwrights Lab, don't get me wrong, but I do believe that the visibility of the Banff Centre's programming, because it's such a big organization, it is regarded as a prestige establishment for better or worse, that having directing the majority of our support and resources to the work of artists of color and the stories that they're telling is critical as a contribution to changing the Banff Centre for one, in some small ways, in amplifying those voices, because those voices will ultimately get on stage, many of them. And the Banff Centre can have a huge role in making that happen, both by the resources that these artists are offered when they come to Banff, but also by the promotion and the platform that a program like Banff can offer to those playwrights when they leave Banff, and the credit that is on their bios, on their resumes, the connections that they make in Banff, the international connections that they make in Banff often, which have been so thrilling to watch. We had a great moment some years ago where Trey Anthony was working on a play at the Lab, and we have a partnership with the National New Play Network in the US, and they send a playwright each year to the Lab with a collaborator sometimes. And their executive director, Nan, came up one year, and she was sitting next to Trey, and we were all introducing ourselves. And Trey said, I live part of the year in Atlanta, but I'm based in Toronto. And Nan said, I used to live in Atlanta. And they bonded in that moment in Banff, and Nan helped Trey get a playwright residency in Atlanta that has led to several productions and to Trey living more of her life in Atlanta because she's found a second theater creative home. That sort of thing is a responsibility that Banff takes very seriously, that I take very seriously, and who we are able to invite to be exposed to and to be able to take advantage of those opportunities makes a huge difference. Again, a long answer to your really direct question, but I believe that because of the focus areas that we've looked at and our thoughtfulness about who we invite to the Lab in all of those areas, that the Lab is having impact far beyond that little part of the mountains west of Calgary.
It was such a gift. I mean, as a really baby playwright, and it was a complete fluke that it happened to be me who went, because the invitation was extended through ATYP for their resident playwright, and it just happened to be me at the time. But yeah, I mean, I know that was the first time I wrote playwright on a customs card coming into a country, and
that's
the immigration
amazing.
Officer asks why you're there, and you hand them the letter from Banff, and they wonder if playwright is an actual career. It was I know it was fundamental to my development as practice. So it's really extraordinary to hear about, the very conscious effort that's being made to champion these artists and their voices. Because exactly as you said, we can't have these stories if we don't have those artists, and they don't have those opportunities to think and dream and work together and kind of foment those ideas and that change.
And champion is such a great word. I love that word. That's exactly it. And also to meet each other and one another. Canada's in a huge country, and while there are lots of ways through the theatre industry, through touring and through festivals and through conferences that folks meet each other, playwrights are not part of that network to the same degree as other members of the theatre ecology. And so Banff plays, as do a number of other playwright residency organizations in Canada, play a hugely important role in connecting playwrights with one another, not to work together, but for mutual support, for affirmation, for inspiration, for collaboration. Just in the same way, artists meeting you, Canadian artists meeting you, makes a difference to their work in ways that we may never be able to track, whose impact we may never be able to make into a metric, but I know is real, and I know has impact, and I know has lasting repercussions for how people think about the work, about which stories they believe they should tell, and which stories they believe the world wants to hear. And if we can convey to more people that the stories that they want to tell are ones we all want to hear, that's making change.
Okay, well, I have so many questions for you, Brian, and I know that we're coming to the end of our hour. I wanted to, maybe just before we wrap up, ask you a little bit about LMDA, because it's an incredible organization, and I think that's kind of where you met a lot of the Australian dramaturgs who I know have kind of visited Banff, or you've had working relationships with. What does it do, and why is it so important that an organisation like LMDA exists? I mean, it speaks a little bit to what you were saying about playwrights being, we're not as connected to those touring and those other kind of ways of moving across countries and within countries. Is that kind of what LMDA does, bring together? But actually, no, I'm just going to let you answer that question.
It is part of what it does, because dramaturgs, often work in parallel. They rarely work with one another. And while we have we're colleagues, and many of us know each other across the country, or indeed across the US and beyond now, we rarely, very rarely, almost never actually work with each other. So the opportunity to share how we do work, or how we choose to work, or how we wish we could work, or how we wish the world would let us work, which is some of the conversation sometimes in frustration, is really critical. That's not unique to the practice of dramaturgy, but because we work in parallel, it has been so valuable for 35 years now that LMDA has multiple ways to bring dramaturgs together to share about how they work, to share and to design ways to facilitate and foster and amplify better ways of working, better working conditions for the industry, better and more effective relationships with theater organizations and theater management. So some of that is pure service organization type resources like employment guidelines to better describe the nature of dramaturgical positions and jobs, both freelance and institutional, and to better describe how dramaturgs might negotiate contracts, to provide sample contracts that help this very, dramaturgy isn't special, but it's ephemeral and it's nuanced and it's very different from person to person. So contracting that is very hard. LMDA as a service organization has done a lot of work over many years to help dramaturgs and organizations negotiate contracts so that more of us can be hired, so we can contribute more effectively to more processes. There's a huge range of sort of service-related documents and tools that LMDA has generated over the last 30 years that have helped improve our field and that have helped more people enter our field and feel supported within it and be able to sustain their careers within this field. It has brought people together through conferences and now increasingly, obviously, through digital means and digital conferences. Next year, we will have, as we did this year, we'll have a digital and a live conference. It has been really critical about international relationships. So initially between the US and Canada, and then in the US and Canada and Mexico. And we have a long-standing relationship with the Dramaturgs Network in the UK. Myself and Liz Engelman, an American dramaturg, went over there in the early 2000s to talk with them multiple times about what it would mean, what it might mean to set up a service organization for dramaturgs there, increasingly with countries elsewhere in the world. And now recently the establishment of LMDA Mexico. The Mexican, the nuances of dramaturgy in Mexico are very different, not surprisingly, than they are in Canada and the UK and the US, as they should be. And so encouraging Mexican artists there to find and establish an organization makes sense for their landscape has really been fantastic to watch. And non-Mexican dramaturgs gain because the perspectives of how they work in Mexico are so different and so inspiring, I think, to those who are not part of that community. And dramaturgs we're sponges. We look for ideas, we look for connection, we look for opportunities, we look for new ideas, we look for collaborators, that we file away interesting people and opportunities. As you know, having come to Banff, what a great example of filing away. Here it's 4 or 5 years later, and here we are talking, again, that's such a great example of how dramaturgs and theater artists file away references and networks and relationships and potential collaborations. That's all of what LMDA is about, fostering and encouraging. And I should add that we're an entirely volunteer organization. So the items, the initiatives that LMDA generates are ones that are driven by people who need them or identify a need in their friends and colleagues in the field and make them happen. And there's something really powerful about that. There's nothing extraneous in an organization like that. It all is tangible and is designed to support other people, other individuals making work.
Thank you so much. I think there's a lot, especially that Australia could look at as well in terms of, I mean, there is an Asian Dramaturgs Network, but, you know, the way that we can kind of, I guess, connect with the countries around us, particularly dramaturgs, as you said, who are connectors. I always think of dramaturgs as this terrible nerds of the theatre. I think dramaturgs are the most passionate, interested people, very good at connecting other artists as well. Some of the best kind of creative arranged marriages I've ever had have been set up by dramaturgs. Yes, thank you so much for your time today, Brian. It's been such a joy getting to talk to you a little bit about your work and about your process, and about the various organisations that you've been involved with. Yes, thank you for joining us and for sharing all of your thoughts and your experience.
Well, thank you again for the invitation, for having such a great reason to reconnect and spend, you know, an hour with you is a huge pleasure to me as well. Staying connected with you and the other artists I've met through Banff in Australia has been a great gift of my time at Banff, of the Playwrights Lab. So thank you for your interest and the interest in dramaturgy and the various practices that I've, you know, had a real pleasure investigating over all of these years.
Always, any excuse.
Likewise.